The first thing the visitors learned about humans was that they built things meant to be held, not merely operated. This was not obvious from orbit, where the planet's night side glittered with geometric restraint, nor from the polite emissions of the listening arrays that ringed the system like cautious birds. It became clear only when the visitors finally descended, when a delegation of bodies grown for vacuum and low gravity found themselves stepping into a place where nearly every surface bore the memory of fingers. The railings were worn smooth by palms. The doors bore shallow arcs where hands had pushed rather than waited for mechanisms. Even the walls carried scars, scuffs where people had leaned while thinking, or braced themselves while laughing, or struck once in frustration, and then left the mark as a reminder that strength was something to be mastered rather than hidden. The visitors had not expected that. They had expected efficiency, or perhaps waste. They had expected structures grown by algorithms and perfected by long optimization. Instead, they found weight, texture, and a curious abundance of redundancies that made no sense if one assumed that failure was unacceptable. Humans did not assume that. Humans assumed that failure was inevitable, and so they built for it, around it, and sometimes because of it. The first contact occurred not in a grand hall or a ceremonial plateau, but in a fabrication bay at the edge of a coastal city whose name meant something untranslatable, something like where the water argues with the land. The bay had once been a shipyard, then a disaster response hub, then a cooperative workshop where independent crews shared tools too large or too expensive to own alone. It was there because the visitors had followed the signals of construction, not power, not computation. They followed the noise of creation. The human present was named Marrow Quince. The name was self-chosen, not inherited, a practice still common among humans who reached a certain age and decided that the shape of their life demanded a different sound. Marrow Quince was tall, dense in the way of someone who had spent decades lifting and assembling, hair bound back with a strip of composite cloth that bore scorch marks from a welding incident long past. When the visitors entered, their bodies shimmering with field effects and cautious mass compensation, Marrow Quince was holding a spanner in one hand and a length of carbon weave in the other, arguing with a younger human about load tolerances. The visitors waited. They had learned patience the hard way across millennia. They could afford to observe. They noted how Marrow Quince did not stop talking while adjusting the spanner, how the tool fit the hand as though it had been shaped for that particular grip, how the younger human leaned in, nodding, occasionally interrupting, unafraid. They noted the absence of deference, the presence of respect without fear. These were data points that did not fit easily into their models. When Marrow Quince finally noticed them, it was not with alarm. It was with curiosity edged by mild annoyance, the same expression one might offer an unexpected delivery that arrived during a complicated task. Marrow Quince set the spanner down carefully, wiped hands on trousers already stained beyond redemption, and approached. "You are not from the Harbor Authority," Marrow Quince said. "You are not from the Research Council. You are not from the insurance syndicates. Thank whatever remains of luck. That narrows it down." The visitors communicated without sound, but they had prepared a vocal interface for this moment. The voice that emerged was textured, layered, clearly an attempt to mirror human vocal nuance without fully understanding it. "We are representatives of a coalition of interstellar polities. We have come to initiate formal contact with your species." Marrow Quince considered this, eyes tracking the subtle distortions around the visitors' forms. "You picked a strange place to do it." "We picked the place where humans were most human," the visitors replied. "Our instruments suggested this location." Marrow Quince laughed, a short bark that echoed off steel and composite. "Your instruments need calibration, or maybe they are better than ours. Either way, welcome. Mind the floor, there is a loose panel near the press." The visitors adjusted their internal maps in real time. They followed Marrow Quince deeper into the bay, past half-assembled frames and bins of fasteners sorted by size and shape rather than standardized code. Humans sorted by feel as much as by sight. It was inefficient. It was also remarkably fast in practiced hands. Formalities were attempted, then abandoned. The visitors had prepared a long statement about mutual non-aggression, about the sharing of knowledge, about the careful steps required to integrate a new species into the broader community of thinking life. Marrow Quince listened for a while, then raised a hand. "You are talking like this is a one-time thing," Marrow Quince said. "Like you show up, we sign something, and that is that. That is not how we do things. We will need to build this. Slowly, together, it will break sometimes, we will fix it." This was not in the visitors' briefing materials. They had encountered many species, most wanted guarantees, some wanted dominance, a few wanted isolation. None had suggested that contact itself was a structure to be assembled, tested, repaired. One of the visitors adjusted its field, a gesture that in its culture signaled interest. "You speak as though you expect failure." Marrow Quince shrugged. "Of course, anything worth doing fails at first. Sometimes it keeps failing. The trick is to learn faster than you break." The visitors recorded this. It would be quoted later, in chambers light years away, by beings who had never held a tool and would never understand why this statement carried such weight. In the weeks that followed, more visitors arrived, and more humans were brought into the conversation. Not leaders in the traditional sense, not the ones who gave speeches or signed treaties, but the ones who maintained infrastructure, who coordinated response networks, who understood the fragile web that kept billions alive on a restless planet. The visitors learned quickly that human authority was diffuse, situational, earned through competence, and lost through negligence. It made negotiations difficult. It also made deception nearly impossible. The first real test came sooner than anyone expected. Beyond the outer orbits of the system, a structure failed. It was not human-made. It was ancient, a relic of a long-vanished species whose automated guardians still patrolled a region of space threaded with unstable physics. The guardians detected the visitors, increased activity, and responded according to protocols written before humans had learned to shape stone. The response was not malicious, but it was overwhelming. A cascade of gravitational distortions rippled inward, threatening not only the visitors' ships, but the fragile balance of the system's outer colonies. The visitors convened an emergency council. They debated retreat. They debated escalation. They debated sacrifice, calculating which losses would be acceptable to preserve the greater whole. This was how they had always handled crisis. They informed the humans as a courtesy. Marrow Quince was present, along with others whose names were equally unfamiliar to the visitors' databases. They listened as the visitors explained the situation, the probabilities, the likely outcomes. They listened as the visitors spoke of evacuation and containment, of writing off distant habitats as unfortunate but necessary losses. When the explanation ended, there was a pause. Not the visitors' kind of pause, which was full of internal computation, but a human pause filled with glances, with breaths taken and released, with hands rubbing against fabric. "You are telling us," said a human named Seren Holt, whose hands were scarred in patterns that suggested both machinery and fire, "that something built a long time ago is about to break our system, and your solution is to step back and let it." "We would not phrase it in those terms," the visitors replied. "But yes, intervention would require capabilities you do not possess." Marrow Quince leaned forward. "You do not know what we possess, you know what we standardize. Those are not the same." The visitors did not understand this distinction. They would later. Humans did not have weapons that could match the Guardians. They did not have fields that could damp the distortions. What they had was an absurd amount of experience with systems that were not supposed to work together, being forced to do so anyway. They had ships designed for hauling, for rescue, for patching breaches in storms of debris. They had crews trained to improvise under pressure, to accept casualties without surrendering to them. They proposed a plan that made the visitors' internal risk assessments spike into levels usually reserved for extinction scenarios. The plan involved placing mass where mass did not belong, using human vessels as anchors to redirect the distortions, sacrificing ships, if necessary, to bleed off energy. It involved manual intervention in regions where automated systems would fail catastrophically. "This will cost lives," the visitors said. Marrow Quince nodded. "Yes, this will cost ships. Yes, this may not succeed. Yes." The visitors waited for the rest. There was none. "Why?" one of the visitors finally asked. "Would you proceed?" Marrow Quince looked at the projections, at the arcs of probability that meant nothing to human eyes. Then Marrow Quince looked at a photograph pinned to a workbench nearby, a group of humans standing in front of a half-built structure, smiling, arms slung over shoulders, grease on their faces. "Because those habitats are full of people who trust that someone will try," Marrow Quince said. "And because if we do not, we will spend the rest of our history knowing exactly when we decided that effort was optional." The visitors did not have a framework for this. Their ethics were complex, but they were optimized. They minimized suffering across vast scales. Individual stories blurred. Humanity insisted on the opposite direction of focus, on the weight of single lives as anchors for action. The operation began within days. Human ships, ungainly and over-reinforced, moved into positions that made the visitors' pilots recoil. Crews worked in conditions that pushed biological limits, relying on redundancy and mutual support rather than perfect control. When distortions tore at hulls, humans patched them from the inside, hands steady despite the knowledge that a misstep meant death. The visitors assisted where they could, their advanced systems stabilizing the worst fluctuations, but it was the humans who closed the gaps, who made themselves part of the system rather than observers of it. 2 ships were lost. 3 habitats were saved. The cascade dissipated, its energy bled away by sacrifice and stubbornness. Afterward, in the quiet that followed crisis, the visitors reviewed the data. The numbers were unacceptable by their standards. The losses were too high, the margins too thin, and yet the outcome was undeniably positive. An entire region of space remained inhabited because a species with inferior technology had refused to accept the premise that some losses were tidy. They returned to the fabrication bay where first contact had occurred. Marrow Quince was there again, hands on a new project, eyes tired but bright. "You will change your assessment of us," Marrow Quince said without looking up. "Yes," the visitors replied, "we will." "In what direction?" The visitors paused, an echo of the human habit. "We have long believed that the measure of a species was the elegance of its solutions. We are beginning to suspect that we have misunderstood the problem." Marrow Quince smiled, a slow expression that creased a face shaped by effort. "We are very good at holding things together," Marrow Quince said. "Sometimes longer than they should be held, sometimes long enough to find a better way." This was the moment, later agreed upon by many historians, when humanity ceased to be categorized as a developing civilization and began to be regarded as something far more unsettling. Not conquerors, not saviors. Builders who refused to put their hands down even when the weight was crushing, and who invited others to help not because they were certain of success, but because the act of trying was, to them, the only acceptable measure of worth. In the months that followed the crisis beyond the outer orbits, the visitors discovered that survival was not the most disruptive thing humans could accomplish. Survival, after all, could be folded into existing models with enough qualifiers and cautionary footnotes. What proved more difficult to integrate was what humans did next. They did not celebrate. They did not retreat into grief rituals that isolated loss into private spaces. They went back to work, not with the grim efficiency the visitors expected, but with a peculiar intensity that combined remembrance and preparation as though the two were inseparable. The lost ships were not quietly erased from records. Their names were spoken aloud in workshops, etched into the frames of new vessels, referenced during design arguments as constraints that mattered. A human would say that a joint needed reinforcing because a ship named for a river had failed there, or that a system needed manual override because a vessel named after an extinct animal had been lost when automation refused to yield. These references were not sentimental in the visitor's sense. They were practical, almost clinical, but they carried a weight that algorithms could not assign. Memory was a structural component. The visitors established a permanent presence in the system, a cluster of habitats and observation platforms placed with meticulous symmetry. Humans visited them, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of curiosity. The visitors found these encounters disorienting. Humans touched things. They leaned against railings not designed for load. They sat on floors. They modified spaces without asking permission, adding handles, markings, layers of redundancy that offended aesthetic principles refined over ages. At first, the visitors attempted to prevent this. They issued polite notices, then firmer directives, explaining that alterations could compromise structural integrity. Humans listened, nodded, and then returned later with calculations, with mock-ups, with hands-on demonstrations showing how the modifications increased resilience under failure conditions the visitors had not prioritized. The arguments were not confrontational. They were relentless. The visitors learned that humans treated disagreement as an invitation to collaborate rather than a signal to withdraw. This became particularly evident when the question of shared technology arose. The visitors possessed systems that could transform human infrastructure, increasing efficiency, reducing waste, extending lifespans. They proposed a gradual transfer, controlled and monitored, to avoid destabilization. Humans agreed in principle, then immediately began dismantling the proposed framework to examine its assumptions. A human named Koldevesh, whose background spanned disaster engineering and sociological modeling, articulated the concern in a way that echoed through subsequent negotiations. Koldevesh pointed out that introducing technology without introducing the failure modes it had been designed to address would create a false sense of security. Humans did not want tools that worked perfectly. They wanted tools that failed predictably, visibly, and in ways that allowed intervention. The visitors struggled with this. Their own history was marked by a gradual elimination of manual processes, a steady march towards systems so robust that individual action became irrelevant. They had achieved stability, but at the cost of adaptability they no longer noticed because it had been gone for so long. Humans, by contrast, seemed to cultivate adaptability even when it appeared wasteful. A joint project was proposed as a compromise. Rather than transferring finished systems, the visitors would collaborate with human teams to design something new, something that combined advanced theory with human insistence on tactile engagement. The project chosen was deceptively modest, a deep space construction platform intended to operate at the edge of known navigational safety, where physics grew unreliable and automation alone could not be trusted. The platform was to be built not in orbit, but in stages, assembled by crews rotating through extreme conditions. The visitors provided materials and field stabilizers. Humans provided design philosophies that emphasized accessibility, manual override, and the assumption that something somewhere would go wrong at the worst possible moment. Construction began amid tension. The visitors' builders, grown rather than trained, worked with precision and quiet coordination. Human crews arrived noisy, argumentative, laden with tools that bore personal modifications. They labeled everything. They argued about labels. They changed labels when new information emerged. The visitors recorded all of this, attempting to find patterns that could be abstracted. One such pattern emerged around decision-making under uncertainty. When confronted with incomplete data, the visitors' builders paused, awaiting additional input. human builders acted. They chose a path, not because it was optimal, but because it was reversible. This concept of reversibility fascinated the visitors. Their own systems aimed to minimize the need for reversal by ensuring correctness from the outset. Humans accepted that correctness was provisional. During the third construction cycle, a failure occurred. A stabilizer field oscillated unexpectedly, stressing the platform's central spine. Automated systems flagged the anomaly and initiated shutdown procedures that would have halted work for days. Human crews, already embedded in the structure, felt the vibration through their boots and hands. They did not wait for directives. They braced, reinforced, rerouted power manually, and rode the oscillation long enough for the system to dampen. The visitors watched in alarm as humans exposed themselves to forces that exceeded recommended safety margins. When the oscillation ceased and the platform remained intact, the visitors issued a formal reprimand, citing unacceptable risk exposure. The response was not defensive. It was explanatory. A human named Jora Pell, whose calm under pressure had become a quiet legend among the crews, explained that the risk had been assessed in real time based on sensory input no instrument could fully capture. The vibration had a texture, a rhythm that suggested instability but not imminent failure. Waiting would have allowed the oscillation to amplify. Acting reduced the window of danger. The visitors had no way to validate this explanation within their existing frameworks. They could only note that it was consistent with outcomes. As the platform neared completion, it became a gathering point not just for builders, but for thinkers, planners, and those humans who specialized in anticipating improbable futures. Conversations unfolded in shared spaces where gravity was adjustable and walls bore the marks of frequent contact. Humans asked questions the visitors found unsettling, not because they were hostile, but because they probed assumptions that had never been articulated. What happens when your systems encounter something truly novel? How do you recover when your models fail? Who is responsible when optimization produces harm? The visitors answered as best they could, drawing on histories of adaptation and refinement. Humans listened, then countered with scenarios drawn from their own past, filled with messy recoveries and partial solutions that nonetheless preserved the possibility of change. The platform was completed ahead of the visitors' most conservative estimates, though behind their most optimistic ones. Humans considered this a success. The visitors recalibrated their definitions. The platform's first mission was not scientific exploration or resource extraction. Humans proposed using it as a testing ground for joint response protocols, deliberately exposing it to controlled failures to observe how mixed crews adapted. The visitors agreed, with reservations. The failures were anything but controlled. Variables interacted in ways no simulation had predicted. Systems failed in cascades that threatened total loss. Each time, human intervention altered the trajectory, sometimes at great personal cost, sometimes through improvisations that bordered on the absurd. A section of hull was once reinforced with a temporary lattice built from repurposed tool handles and structural foam, a solution that violated multiple engineering principles but held long enough for permanent repairs. The visitors, analysts, were forced to confront a growing body of evidence that their metrics for resilience were incomplete. They had optimized for endurance under known stresses. Humans optimized for recovery after unknown ones. This realization coincided with the arrival of troubling news from beyond the system. Other polities within the Visitors' Coalition had taken note of humanity's actions during the earlier crisis. Interpretations varied. Some viewed humans as liabilities, unpredictable actors whose willingness to risk lives could destabilize carefully balanced regions. Others saw opportunity, a potential source of adaptive strategies that could bolster collective security. A delegation arrived, not to observe, but to evaluate. They did not come to the fabrication bays or the construction platform. They convened in a sterile environment designed to project authority, where surfaces resisted touch and every process was mediated by layers of protocol. Humans attended, reluctantly, aware that this was a different kind of encounter. Maro Quince was present again, along with Calder and others whose influence stemmed not from titles but from accumulated trust. The evaluation proceeded with formal statements, with projections of risk and benefit, with thinly veiled concerns about human unpredictability. One evaluator articulated the core fear plainly. Humans, they said, could not be relied upon to act in accordance with collective optimization. Their tendency to prioritize immediate, localized outcomes over long-term statistical benefit made them dangerous partners. Maro Quince listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When it was time to respond, Maro Quince did not deny the charge. Instead, Maro Quince reframed it. "You are right," Maro Quince said. "We do not optimize for the same things you do. We optimize for continuity of agency, for the ability of people on the ground to make a difference when systems fail. That looks like chaos from far away. Up close, it is the only thing that keeps us from freezing." The evaluators pressed, citing scenarios where such behavior could escalate conflicts or undermine coordinated responses. Calder responded by describing historical moments when centralized control had collapsed and only decentralized action prevented total loss. Jora Pell spoke of the platform, of moments when protocol would have doomed them. The debate was not resolved in that chamber. It could not be, but something shifted. The visitors who had first made contact found themselves defending humanity, not out of sentiment, but out of hard-won understanding. They spoke of hands on railings, of tools worn to fit individuals, of failures turned into lessons embedded in physical structures. The evaluation concluded with a provisional status. Humanity would not be fully integrated. They would be designated as adaptive partners, a category rarely used and poorly defined. It came with restrictions and expectations, with oversight and conditions. Humans accepted it with a mixture of irritation and relief. After the delegation departed, life resumed its uneven rhythm. The platform continued its work. New projects emerged. The visitors found themselves increasingly reliant on human insight when confronting anomalies that defied prediction. One such anomaly appeared without warning, a region of space where causality itself seemed frayed, events unfolding out of sequence. The visitors' instruments struggled. Human observers reported sensations of displacement, of déjà vu sharpened into something almost painful. The phenomenon threatened trade routes and communication corridors. The visitors began their analyses, constructing models of unprecedented complexity. Humans, meanwhile, proposed sending a crew through the region, not to solve it, but to experience it, to gather subjective data that instruments could not capture. The visitors objected, citing extreme risk. Humans countered that understanding required exposure. The argument echoed previous ones, but this time the stakes were broader, the implications more profound. As preparations began, the visitors reflected on how quickly they had come to accept human presence in decisions that affected entire regions. It unsettled them. It also felt, in some inarticulate way, necessary. The ship chosen for the mission was not sleek. It was layered, reinforced, bristling with manual controls and access points. Its crew was small, selected for adaptability rather than specialization. Maro Quince did not go. Others did, carrying with them the accumulated lessons of a species that refused to let go when things became uncertain. As the ship departed, entering a region where cause and effect tangled, the visitors watched, calculations running, probabilities branching. For the first time in their long history, they found themselves hoping not just for success, but for stories that would teach them how to hold on when the universe itself seemed to slip from grasp. The region where causality frayed did not announce itself with spectacle. There was no sudden wall of light, no violent transition from the familiar to the alien. The ship crossed an invisible threshold, and the universe simply began to behave as though it had forgotten the order of its own sentences. Instruments registered readings before the actions that caused them. Shadows appeared where no object yet stood. Communications echoed replies to questions that had not been asked. The visitors' observers, monitoring from a safe distance, experienced a deep discomfort that bordered on existential vertigo. Their sciences had accounted for paradox as a mathematical curiosity, not as an environment. The human crew experienced something different. Fear, yes, but layered with a kind of grim attentiveness that had been honed across centuries of operating in places where certainty was a luxury. The ship's name was a compound word from an old coastal dialect, roughly meaning held together despite the tide. It was not a poetic choice, it was a promise. The captain was named Orrin Hale, a human whose career had been defined by situations where procedure ended and judgment began. Orrin Hale did not attempt to impose narrative order on the unfolding anomalies. Instead, Orrin Hale instructed the crew to log everything, including sensations, emotional responses, and half-formed intuitions. This confounded the visitors' analysts, who struggled to integrate such data. For the humans, it was second nature. They had long learned that what could not be measured still mattered. As the ship progressed, time ceased to behave uniformly. A crew member would finish a task and find that hours had passed for others while only minutes had elapsed subjectively. Arguments occurred before their causes, tempers flaring over mistakes not yet made. The crew adapted by adopting a fluid command structure, deferring authority to whoever was most temporally aligned with the immediate problem. This flexibility prevented paralysis, but it also revealed something unsettling. Individual experience had become unreliable as a foundation for shared reality. The visitors watched these developments with mounting concern. Their own models predicted rapid cognitive collapse under such conditions, yet the human crew persisted, not by resolving contradictions, but by containing them. They treated paradox like a structural stress, something to be distributed across the system rather than eliminated. At one point, the ship encountered a region where its own past trajectory intersected with its present. Sensors detected echoes of the vessel at multiple positions, some damaged, some intact. One echo showed a catastrophic hull breach that had not yet occurred. The visitors, analysts flagged this as a probable future and recommended immediate withdrawal. Orrin Hale convened the crew. The discussion that followed was recorded in full and would later be studied by human philosophers and visitor theoreticians alike. The crew did not debate whether the echo represented destiny. They debated whether the information was useful. They concluded that it was. They adjusted course slightly, reinforced the section indicated by the echo, and proceeded. The hull breach did occur, but not catastrophically. The reinforcement held long enough for emergency repairs. The visitors, analysts noted that by acting on a possible future without granting it authority, the humans had altered outcomes without attempting to dominate them. This subtle distinction challenged deeply held assumptions about prediction and control. As the ship moved deeper, causality did not merely fray, it folded. The crew encountered phenomena that suggested multiple outcomes coexisting, unresolved. Instead of choosing one, the humans learned to operate as though all were partially true. They developed protocols that assumed contradictory states, building redundancy not just in hardware, but in interpretation. Orders were issued with contingencies embedded, actions taken with the expectation that their consequences might arrive out of sequence. The visitors, observers began to experience a form of cognitive strain simply by monitoring the data. Their minds, evolved and engineered for coherence, struggled with sustained ambiguity. Some withdrew seeding analysis to automated systems that fared no better. A few persisted, forcing themselves to adopt provisional frameworks inspired by human reports. They described the experience later as profoundly uncomfortable but enlightening. The ship reached the heart of the anomaly, a region where cause and effect seemed less like a chain and more like a cloud. Here, the crew encountered something unexpected. Not an intelligence in any conventional sense, but a pattern of persistence, a tendency for certain configurations to recur across contradictory timelines. It was as though the universe, in this place, preferred some arrangements over others without committing to why. Humans recognized this instinctively. They had seen it before in complex systems on their own world, in ecosystems, economies, and social structures that resisted simple explanation. They called it a kind of stubbornness. The ship's engineers began interacting with the anomaly, introducing small perturbations and observing which configurations reasserted themselves. They treated the region not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a material to be worked. This approach alarmed the visitors. Interacting with such a phenomenon risked amplifying instability. Humans acknowledged this and proceeded anyway, carefully, incrementally, always prepared to retreat. Their goal was not mastery, but mapping the contours of persistence. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain trajectories dampened instability, others exacerbated it. By aligning movement with the anomaly's preferences, the ship reduced temporal shear and maintained coherence longer than any model had predicted. The breakthrough came when a crew member named Fenra Cade proposed an analogy drawn from an ancient human craft, basket weaving. Fenra Cade suggested that the anomaly behaved like flexible material under tension, that forcing it into a rigid shape caused tearing, while weaving with its natural give produced strength. This metaphor, dismissed at first by the visitors, analysts as imprecise, proved remarkably predictive when translated into mathematical terms. The anomaly responded to distributed influence rather than concentrated force. Armed with this insight, the crew began laying the groundwork for a navigational corridor, not by stabilizing the region outright, but by establishing a pattern of passage that the anomaly tolerated. They did this through repeated traversals, each one adjusting slightly, reinforcing a path through use rather than imposition. The visitors watched as a route emerged not because it was declared, but because it was practiced. The cost was high. Crew members experienced long-term cognitive effects, memory fragmentation, temporal dislocation. Some would never fully recover. The humans accepted this with a somber clarity. Support structures were prepared. No one pretended the price was acceptable. They proceeded because the alternative was to leave a growing hazard unaddressed. When the ship finally withdrew, carrying with it terabytes of data and a crew altered in ways both subtle and profound, the visitors faced a reckoning. The anomaly, once an insurmountable threat, had been rendered navigable, not eliminated, but integrated into the fabric of interstellar movement. Trade routes could be rerouted. Communication delays could be predicted. The universe had not been forced into compliance. It had been met halfway. The visitors convened an extraordinary assembly to review the findings. For the first time, human representatives were not merely present, but central to the discussion. Orrin Hale, speaking with the measured cadence of someone still adjusting to linear time, described the mission not as a success, but as an ongoing relationship with uncertainty. Fenra Cade elaborated on the weaving analogy, emphasizing that maintenance would be required. The corridor would degrade if unused. Stability was an activity, not a state. This notion unsettled the assembly. Many of the visitors' systems were designed around the assumption that stability, once achieved, could be preserved indefinitely with sufficient oversight. Humans challenged this, gently but persistently. They pointed to their own history, to infrastructure that decayed without care, to social agreements that required renewal, to bodies that demanded constant attention. Nothing held itself together forever. A dissenting faction within the assembly argued that humanity's influence was already too great, that their methods, while effective in crises, eroded the predictability upon which large-scale cooperation depended. They warned that adopting human approaches wholesale would lead to fragmentation, to a loss of the elegant coherence that had allowed the coalition to endure. Marrow Quince, present again despite the physical toll of age, responded with a statement that would be recorded and debated for generations. Marrow Quince acknowledged the risk. Humans did fragment. They argued, diverged, failed loudly and often. But they also reconnected, repaired, and learned in ways that static systems could not. Predictability, Marrow Quince suggested, was valuable, but it was not the same as resilience. You have built a structure that assumes the ground will not shift, Marrow Quince said. We come from a place where it always does. We are not asking you to tear down what you have built. We are asking you to put your hands on it, feel where it creaks, and accept that sometimes the only way forward is to keep holding on while it changes. The assembly did not reach consensus. It could not, but policy shifted incrementally. Humans were granted greater latitude in joint operations involving anomalies and failures. Their methodologies were studied, not as curiosities, but as potential templates. Training programs were revised to include experiential learning inspired by human practices. Tools were redesigned to allow manual intervention where none had existed before. Beyond policy, something deeper changed. The visitors began to notice their own environment differently. They added handholds. They accepted wear as information rather than defect. They began to speak of maintenance not as a chore, but as an ongoing conversation with the systems they inhabited. Humanity, for its part, did not become complacent. The costs of their approach were always visible to them. The crew of the mission ship dispersed, some to retirement, some to teaching, some to further risky work. Support networks expanded, informed by lessons learned under impossible conditions. Stories circulated, not glorifying sacrifice, but contextualizing it, embedding it into a larger narrative of shared responsibility. The anomaly corridor became known by a name that translated roughly as the held path. It required constant traversal to remain stable. Humans volunteered to crew the early convoys alongside visitors who were slowly acclimating to uncertainty. Each journey reinforced the path, not just physically, but culturally, normalizing the idea that some routes existed only because someone kept walking them. In quiet moments, the visitors who had first encountered humanity reflected on how far they had come from that fabrication bay by the water. They thought of worn railings, of hands smoothing rough edges, of structures designed to fail gracefully rather than not at all. They realized that humanity's greatest contribution was not bravery or ingenuity alone, but a relentless refusal to disengage when systems faltered. Where other species stepped back to preserve perfection, humans stepped in to preserve possibility. They did not worship order. They worked with it, argued with it, rebuilt it when it broke. In a universe that was proving far less stable than once believed, this trait was no longer merely unsettling. It was indispensable. The held path did not remain a curiosity for long. Routes that depended on use rather than decree began to proliferate, not only through anomalous regions, but through institutional structures as well. The coalition of visitors, long accustomed to stable hierarchies and fixed mandates, found itself adapting to processes that required continual engagement. This was not announced as reform. It emerged piecemeal, through practical necessity, through moments when static solutions failed and someone, often human, stayed present long enough to improvise continuity. This gradual shift unsettled many. Among the visitors, there were those whose identities were deeply bound to systems that no longer felt immutable. Their civilizations had achieved peace by minimizing variance, by smoothing out local irregularities in favor of galactic-scale coherence. Humanity's influence did not shatter that coherence outright, but it introduced texture. Decisions now carried traces of context. Exceptions were no longer treated as errors to be eliminated, but as signals demanding attention. The first major rupture came not from an anomaly of physics, but from a crisis of coordination. On the far side of Coalition space lay a cluster of inhabited systems bound together by shared resource flows. Their infrastructure relied on an ancient optimization engine, a distributed intelligence designed to balance supply, demand, and environmental limits across centuries. It had worked flawlessly for longer than most living beings could remember. When fluctuations occurred, they were dampened automatically. Scarcity was predicted and mitigated before it could be felt. Then the engine began to lag. At first, the delays were negligible, measured in micro-intervals that only the most sensitive instruments detected. Then shipments arrived slightly out of phase. Storage systems compensated. Populations noticed nothing. The Coalition's analysts identified the issue as a minor desynchronization, likely the result of cumulative rounding errors in the engine's long-term projections. A recalibration was scheduled. Before it could occur, a cascade began. The engine's predictions, once self-correcting, began to diverge. Each correction introduced new discrepancies. Feedback loops amplified noise rather than suppressing it. Within weeks, entire systems experienced shortages of critical components while surplus accumulated elsewhere, inaccessible due to misaligned logistics. The engine attempted to compensate by increasing control, narrowing tolerances, accelerating decision cycles. This only worsened the instability. The Coalition convened emergency councils. The engine was too deeply embedded to shut down without catastrophic consequences. Its architecture predated many current species. Documentation was incomplete, written in languages no longer spoken, assumptions no longer valid. The Coalition's engineers approached the problem as they always had: isolate the fault, correct it centrally, restore optimal flow. They failed. Humans were brought in reluctantly, initially as observers. Koldevesh was among them, along with several systems engineers whose expertise lay not in optimization, but in failure recovery. They listened as the Coalition explained the engine's design philosophy, its layers of abstraction, its safeguards. Koldevesh asked a question that cut uncomfortably close to the core. When was the last time this system was wrong in a way that mattered to someone on the ground? The Coalition representatives struggled to answer. The engine's purpose had been to prevent such situations. When it worked, its success was invisible. When it failed, it did so at scales that dwarfed individual experience. That might be the problem, Koldevesh said quietly. Human analysis diverged sharply from Coalition norms. Instead of searching for the root fault, they mapped points of human and visitor interaction with the engine. They identified where its decisions met reality, where automated directives became lived constraints. They found that over time, these interfaces had been smoothed, human oversight replaced by trust in abstraction. When the engine drifted, there were no hands left on the levers. The humans proposed something radical: do not fix the engine first, break its monopoly on decision-making. The Coalition recoiled. Fragmenting control risked chaos. The engine existed precisely to avoid local improvisation. Humans acknowledged this and proceeded anyway. They suggested establishing provisional local councils in affected systems, composed of operators, logistics workers, habitat managers, and community representatives. These councils would be granted authority to override engine directives within defined bounds. They would not optimize globally. They would stabilize locally. This will reduce overall efficiency, the Coalition argued. Yes, Koldevesh replied. Efficiency is already failing. We are talking about survival of trust. The proposal passed narrowly, driven less by consensus than by desperation. Implementation was uneven. In some systems, councils formed quickly, leveraging existing social structures. In others, resistance was fierce, fueled by fear of regression and loss of status. Humans assisted where invited, facilitated where tolerated, and stepped back where rejected. The effects were immediate and uneven. Some systems recovered rapidly, redistributing resources through ad hoc agreements, repurposing surplus, improvising logistics. Others floundered, hampered by internal conflict and lack of experience. The engine continued to malfunction, but its failures were now absorbed by layers of human judgment. The coalition's analysts observed something unexpected. Systems with active local engagement not only stabilized faster, but fed information back into the broader network more effectively. Their reports were messy, subjective, filled with qualifiers. They were also timely and grounded. The engine, deprived of absolute authority, began to recalibrate around these inputs, its predictions slowly realigning with lived reality. This did not fix the engine, it changed it. Over time, the optimization routines were rewritten to expect interruption, to incorporate variance introduced by local decisions. The engine became less precise, less elegant, but more robust. It no longer assumed compliance. It negotiated. The coalition faced backlash. Entire factions accused leadership of capitulating to human chaos. They pointed to inefficiencies, to disparities between systems, to the loss of a unifying logic that had defined coalition identity. Debates grew heated. Some systems threatened secession, unwilling to accept a model that placed agency back into fallible hands. Humans did not intervene in these political struggles directly. They had learned, painfully, that imposed solutions rarely endured. What they did was continue to show up where things were breaking, offering methods rather than mandates. One such break occurred in a system whose primary habitat had been built within a slowly decaying megastructure. Maintenance had been automated generations earlier. When supply disruptions hit, repair materials were misallocated, structural degradation accelerated, evacuation was proposed, deemed the most efficient solution. The inhabitants resisted. The habitat was not just shelter, it was history, identity, accumulated adaptation to a hostile environment. Evacuation would save lives, but erase a way of being. A human-led response team arrived, invited by a faction within the habitat that refused to abandon it. The team did not promise salvation. They asked for access. They crawled through maintenance shafts no one had entered in centuries. They mapped damage not just structurally, but socially, identifying which areas mattered most to which communities. They prioritized repairs not by load calculations alone, but by human impact, reinforcing gathering spaces, water systems, and access routes first. The coalition's engineers criticized this approach as inefficient, misaligned with optimal structural stabilization. They were correct in a narrow sense. Parts of the habitat remained fragile longer than ideal. But the reinforced areas became hubs of coordination, where inhabitants organized repair efforts, redistributed labor, and maintained morale. Over months, the habitat stabilized, not restored to its original specifications, but transformed. Some sections were abandoned deliberately, repurposed as buffers. Others were reinforced beyond necessity, serving as anchors. The megastructure would never be what it was. It would endure as something else. The coalition could not ignore the pattern any longer. Wherever humans engaged, systems did not return to idealized states. They evolved. They bore scars. They required ongoing care. They also proved capable of withstanding shocks that would have shattered more pristine arrangements. This realization forced a deeper reckoning with coalition identity. For ages, progress had meant refinement toward perfection, the elimination of noise, the convergence on optimal forms. Humanity represented a different axis of development, one that valued persistence over purity. The debate came to a head during a convocation convened specifically to address humanity's role. Attendance was unprecedented. Observers packed virtual and physical chambers. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the awareness that whatever emerged would redefine the coalition's future. Arguments ranged widely. Some called for formal integration of human methodologies into coalition doctrine. Others demanded strict limits, fearing cultural dilution and systemic instability. A few advocated for distancing, proposing that humanity be confined to peripheral roles where their adaptability could be leveraged without reshaping core structures. Marrow Quince spoke near the end, voice carrying the weight of years spent holding failing systems together. "You keep asking what we will turn you into," Marrow Quince said. "You should be asking what you already are. You built something beautiful and brittle. We are not here to break it. We are here because it is breaking anyway." There was no dramatic resolution, no declaration of unity or schism. What followed was quieter, more consequential. Policy documents were amended with language that acknowledged uncertainty. Training curricula incorporated failure case studies drawn from human experience. New roles emerged, focused on maintenance, mediation, and recovery rather than optimization alone. Humans gained neither dominance nor deference. They gained something stranger, reliance. When systems faltered, when predictions diverged, when neat solutions dissolved, the question arose almost automatically: who is still in the room? Who is willing to keep their hands on this? That question reshaped priorities. Systems were designed with visible wear points. Interfaces allowed for interruption. Authority structures incorporated pathways for dissent grounded in lived experience. None of this eliminated conflict. It made conflict survivable. Humanity, watching these changes unfold, felt no triumph. They recognized the familiar pattern of adoption and resistance, of progress entangled with loss. They mourned the costs, the individuals who burned out, the communities strained by constant engagement. They built support structures as best they could, knowing they would never be sufficient. The universe did not become kinder. New anomalies emerged. Old threats resurfaced. What changed was the coalition's response. Retreat was no longer the default, neither was domination. Increasingly, the response was presence. In this, the visitors began to understand what humanity had been trying to show them from the beginning. Strength was not the absence of strain. It was the capacity to bear it together, to redistribute it, to let it leave marks without letting it tear everything apart. The measure of a civilization, they were learning, was not how perfectly it functioned when nothing went wrong, but how many hands reached out when it did. The first open fracture within the coalition did not begin with weapons or proclamations. It began with refusal. A peripheral polity, one of the oldest signatories, declined to participate in a joint recovery initiative following a stellar flare cascade that crippled several neighboring systems. Their reasoning was precise, carefully worded, and devastating in its logic. The affected systems, they argued, had deviated too far from optimized protocols. Their reliance on localized decision-making, encouraged by recent coalition policy shifts, had increased systemic risk. Assisting them would reinforce maladaptive behavior and undermine long-term stability. The correct response, according to established doctrine, was containment and gradual reabsorption once conditions normalized. The refusal was lawful. It was consistent with coalition precedent. It was, in every formal sense, correct. Humans reacted badly, not with outrage alone, though there was plenty of that, but with a kind of focused alarm that spread quickly through their networks. The affected systems were not abstract to them. Humans had crews embedded there, advisors, builders, maintenance teams who had chosen to stay when evacuation had been offered. Names were known. Faces remembered. The refusal meant those people would be left to endure cascading failures without external support. Emergency sessions were convened. The coalition's leadership attempted to mediate, to frame the refusal as temporary, as a regrettable necessity. Humans pushed back, not with rhetoric, but with logistics. They presented plans for intervention that did not require the refusing polity's resources. They outlined convoys, patchwork supply chains, volunteer crews. The coalition warned them. Independent action would violate coordination accords. It could destabilize already strained relationships. It could provoke escalation. Humans listened, and then did what they had always done when rules collided with lives. They prepared to go anyway. This was the moment many had feared and some had predicted. Humanity, until now, had reshaped systems from within, leveraging consent and necessity. Acting unilaterally marked a departure. It tested the limits of tolerance, the elasticity of the coalition's unity. The convoys were assembled quickly. They were not military formations. They were ugly, functional collections of retrofitted cargo ships, construction platforms, mobile habitats pressed into service. Volunteers came from everywhere humans had a presence, joined by visitors who quietly requested reassignment, citing technical expertise that happened to be urgently needed elsewhere. Caldervesh coordinated logistics, hands moving across layered projections that shifted constantly as new variables emerged. Orin Hale advised on command structure, insisting on distributed authority to prevent paralysis if communications failed. Marrow Quince, older now, remained behind, anchoring political negotiations and acting as a visible reminder that this was not recklessness, but continuity. The convoys departed under a cloud of ambiguity. They were not declared rogue. They were not sanctioned. They existed in a grey zone the coalition had never been forced to acknowledge before. The stellar flare cascade had done more than disrupt power and navigation. It had destabilized planetary magnetospheres, stripped atmospheres in places, triggered geological responses that threatened habitats already stretched thin. Automated systems struggled to cope with the multiplicity of failures. Human crews arriving on site encountered scenes that would have broken less stubborn species. They did not attempt comprehensive repair. They triaged. They stabilized what could be stabilized quickly: life support, water cycles, heat regulation. They worked alongside local populations, adapting plans on the fly as cultural priorities became clear. In one system, preserving a centuries-old agricultural ring took precedence over industrial facilities. In another, a transit hub was reinforced because it served as the only link between scattered communities. The refusing polity monitored these actions with growing unease. Their analysts predicted short-term gains followed by long-term dependency and eventual collapse. They prepared position papers to that effect, ready to justify disengagement when the inevitable occurred. It did not occur. The recovery was uneven, costly, and incomplete. Some habitats were lost, some populations relocated permanently, but many systems stabilized enough to begin their own reconstruction. They did so not by reverting to pre-flare configurations, but by reimagining their infrastructure around what had proven resilient. Local councils, once provisional, became permanent. Interfaces with coalition systems were renegotiated, incorporating manual override and human-mediated checkpoints. The refusing polity faced an uncomfortable reality. The systems they had written off were not collapsing. They were changing in ways that defied prediction but resisted failure. Internal debate intensified. Younger members of that polity questioned doctrines that prioritized abstract stability over lived survival. Elders warned that this path led to fragmentation, to the erosion of the principles that had sustained them for ages. The argument fractured families, institutions, identities. Meanwhile, the coalition as a whole felt the strain. Coordination became harder. Predictive models grew less reliable as human-influenced systems introduced variability by design. Some trade routes slowed. Resource allocation required more negotiation, more context, more time. Critics seized on these inefficiencies as evidence that the human approach was unsustainable at scale. They pointed to increased administrative overhead, to the emotional toll of constant engagement. They were not wrong. Humans did not deny this. Instead, they reframed the cost. "You are paying now for work you deferred for centuries," Caldervesh said during one particularly contentious assembly. "You optimized away maintenance. You externalized care. You assumed stability was free once achieved. It never was." This statement resonated beyond policy circles. Among ordinary inhabitants of coalition space, experiences diverged. Some felt empowered by increased local agency. Others felt abandoned by systems that no longer guaranteed predictability. Anxiety rose, so did participation. The coalition faced a choice it had long postponed. It could attempt to re-centralize authority, reasserting control and marginalizing human methods. Or it could accept a future that would be messier, less elegant, but potentially more resilient. The tipping point came from an unexpected quarter. A core system, one long considered immune to large-scale disruption, experienced a cascading infrastructure failure triggered by a rare confluence of minor anomalies. Automated recovery protocols activated, then stalled, trapped in a loop of self-correction that failed to account for real-world constraints. The system's inhabitants, accustomed to seamless support, were unprepared. Panic spread faster than response. Human teams were not nearby. Coalition response units mobilized, but their arrival would be delayed. In the interim, local populations faced critical shortages. What happened next would later be called the awakening. Individuals within the system began to act, drawing on practices they had observed but never needed. They formed ad hoc councils. They bypassed automated directives. They redistributed resources manually. They reached out to neighboring systems directly, negotiating support without waiting for authorization. It was chaotic. Mistakes were made, but the system did not collapse. When coalition units arrived, they found a population already engaged in recovery, exhausted but organized. The relief was palpable, not just at survival, but at the discovery that they were not helpless. The refusing polity watched this unfold in silence. Shortly thereafter, they requested talks. The negotiations were tense, marked by decades of accumulated certainty on one side and hard-won flexibility on the other. Humans did not lead these talks. They attended, advised when asked, but allowed the coalition to confront itself. The refusing polity acknowledged that their doctrine had failed to account for certain forms of resilience. They did not renounce it. They modified it, carving out space for intervention grounded in presence rather than prediction. It was a small change, but symbolically immense. This did not heal all fractures. Some polities withdrew partially, limiting exposure to what they saw as human-induced volatility. Others leaned in, embracing experimentation. The coalition became less uniform, more federated. For humans, the cost continued to mount. Burnout spread among those who remained constantly engaged. Support networks struggled to keep pace. There were deaths, accidents, quiet resignations. Humanity was not immune to the toll of its own philosophy. This forced an internal reckoning. Marrow Quince convened a gathering not of leaders, but of caretakers, builders, medics, coordinators, those who had spent years holding systems together. The question posed was simple and painful. How long could they keep doing this? The answers varied. Some spoke of limits reached. Others of boundaries never learned. A consensus emerged slowly. Humanity had been acting as if presence required perpetual availability. It did not. They began to formalize rest as a structural necessity. Rotations were enforced. Knowledge was documented not just technically, but narratively, so that others could step in without losing context. Mentorship became a priority, not to replicate heroes, but to distribute competence. Humans started saying no more often, not withdrawing, but choosing where their presence mattered most. This too was disruptive. Systems that had come to rely on human engagement had to adjust, to internalize the practices rather than outsourcing them. This shift marked a maturation of the very influence humanity had introduced. Presence was no longer a resource to be exploited. It was a catalyst meant to change how others operated even in its absence. The coalition observed this with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Humanity was no longer filling every gap. Some gaps reopened. But others remained closed, held together by hands that were no longer human alone. By the time the stellar flare systems reached a new equilibrium, The coalition was irrevocably altered, not unified by a single logic, but bound by shared experience of failure and recovery. Agreements were messier, coordination slower, but when things broke, response came from many directions at once. In quiet corners of coalition space, among species that had once prized flawless continuity above all else, new habits formed, tools were kept within reach, interfaces were left accessible, where was monitored rather than erased, and among humans, a sober pride took root, not triumph, not vindication, but the knowledge that they had not merely intervened. They had taught and learned, and then stepped back enough to let others try. The universe remained vast and indifferent. Systems would continue to fail. But the question that now echoed through coalition space was no longer who was responsible when optimization collapsed. It was who would show up, and how many would be ready to hold on together. Years later, when historians attempted to mark the moment the coalition became something new, they failed repeatedly. There was no single treaty, no decisive battle, no revelation delivered in a chamber designed for memory. Change had arrived the way structural fatigue did, through accumulation, through forces applied again and again, until the shape could no longer remain the same. Humanity had not broken the coalition. The coalition had bent, and in bending, discovered that rigidity had been mistaken for strength. The final proof of this came not from humanity's insistence, but from their absence. It began with a crisis that, by all precedent, should have summoned human intervention immediately. A distant sector experienced a multi-layered failure involving biological contamination, infrastructure collapse, and political paralysis, the kind of compound emergency that had become synonymous with human presence. Requests were drafted, channels opened. No one came, not because humans refused, but because they were already committed elsewhere, stretched thin, deliberately so. Their new doctrine of presence had limits, and this crisis lay beyond them. The coalition hesitated. Old instincts urged caution, isolation, containment. New habits whispered that waiting for perfection would only deepen the wound. After cycles of debate far shorter than those of earlier eras, a decision was made that would once have been unthinkable. The coalition would respond without optimization. They would respond with what they had where they were. Local polities mobilized mixed crews drawn from maintenance divisions, civic organizations, and research collectives that had never before shared authority. They adapted protocols developed alongside humans, not copying them, but internalizing their logic. They accepted that they would not get everything right. They accepted that some losses would occur. They went anyway. The response was imperfect. Communication lagged. Supplies were misrouted. Cultural misunderstandings caused friction, but people adapted. They asked for help horizontally rather than waiting for approval from above. They patched systems temporarily, stabilized populations, and crucially documented what they did not understand rather than hiding it behind assumptions. When the crisis ended, it left scars. It also left something unprecedented. Confidence grounded not in certainty, but in experience. Human observers received reports weeks later. They read them with a mixture of relief and quiet awe. Humanity had not been present, yet their influence was unmistakable, woven through decisions, language, and priorities. Maro Quince, now rarely seen in public, reviewed the documentation in a modest habitation overlooking water that still argued with land. The hands that once shaped structures were slower now, marked by age and injury, but they traced the lines of the reports with care. They did it, Maro Quince said to no one in particular. This was not the end of humanity's involvement, far from it. Humans continued to build, repair, and intervene where needed, but the axis had shifted. They were no longer the ones holding everything together. They were part of a distributed web of responsibility that no longer collapsed when a single strand was removed. The coalition formalized this transformation gradually, wary of naming what was still in motion. New charters emphasized continuity over optimization, adaptability over permanence. Systems were evaluated not only on performance metrics, but on recoverability, on the clarity with which failure could be perceived and addressed. Education changed. Future planners were taught not only how systems worked, but how they broke. Case studies focused on near disasters, on flawed decisions that had nonetheless preserved agency. Students were required to participate in maintenance rotations, to experience the friction of reality rather than abstracting it away. This cultural shift did not eliminate conflict, it sharpened it. Disagreements became more explicit, less hidden behind procedure. Competing values surfaced more often, but conflict no longer implied rupture. It became another form of engagement, another stress to be distributed rather than avoided. Humanity watched all this with mixed emotions. Pride, yes, but also grief for the simplicity that would never return. The Coalition had once offered a vision of effortless continuity, of a universe smoothed into predictable harmony. That vision was gone. In its place stood something more demanding, more honest. Humans recognized it because they had always lived there. The visitors, too, were changed. Species whose ancestors had engineered away manual labor now kept tools close at hand. Beings who had once avoided physical contact learned to value it as a form of information. Wear and imperfection were no longer erased immediately. They were studied. Language shifted subtly. Terms that once implied failure came to denote transition. Maintenance ceased to be a background function and became a respected practice. There were ceremonies now, not of triumph, but of renewal, marking the recommitment to systems that would never be finished. One such ceremony took place at the Deep Space Construction Platform where humans and visitors had first built together. The platform had aged. Its surfaces bore the marks of countless interventions. Its design, once experimental, had become a template replicated across Coalition space. The ceremony did not commemorate its completion. It marked its continued use. Crews gathered, not to celebrate success, but to acknowledge the work that would follow. There were no speeches about destiny. Instead, there were shared accounts of failure, of moments when things nearly came apart and did not because of brilliance, but because someone noticed in time. A visitor whose species had once prided itself on flawless execution spoke quietly with a human technician, hands resting on the same railing. "We used to believe," the visitor said, "that the highest achievement was to create a system that needed no one." The human technician nodded. "We used to believe that too. We were wrong." "What is it now?" the visitor asked. The human considered this, gaze drifting across the platform, the scars, the movement, the constant low hum of ongoing effort. "Something that lets people matter even when it is breaking." The visitor absorbed this, feeling the texture of the railing under unfamiliar appendages. It was worn smooth where countless hands had rested, a map of presence etched into material. The Coalition did not become human. That had never been the point. Species retained their identities, their philosophies, their ways of seeing the universe. What changed was the space between them. It became thicker, more forgiving, capable of absorbing strain without snapping. Humanity, for its part, changed too. They learned restraint. They learned that not every failure required their intervention. They learned to trust that what they had taught, intentionally and otherwise, could propagate without them. This was not easy. Letting go never was. There were still moments when humans stepped forward decisively, when their particular stubbornness and willingness to risk proved essential. New anomalies arose that demanded direct engagement. Old threats resurfaced in unexpected forms. The universe did not grow simpler, but humanity no longer stood alone in those moments. Others stepped beside them, hands on the same problems, sharing the load. In the end, there was no monument erected to mark humanity's impact. No statue enshrined their philosophy. What endured was quieter. In workshops across Coalition space, tools were designed to fit hands rather than abstract specifications. In control rooms, manual overrides were not hidden but highlighted. In planning documents, failure was not relegated to appendices but addressed up front. And when systems strained, when predictions failed, when elegant solutions fractured under the weight of reality, the reflexive question was no longer how to restore perfection. It was who was still here, who was paying attention, who was willing to stay. Humanity's legacy was not domination, nor salvation, nor even innovation in the narrow sense. It was the insistence that participation mattered, that continuity was something built moment by moment, hand by hand. They had arrived as a species that held things together because no one else would. They remained as one that taught others how to do the same and then trusted them enough to let go. In a universe indifferent to intention and hostile to permanence, that trust proved to be the most radical force of all.